Welcome to Minneapolis Business Mentors How to Start a New Business series. These programs cover the basics of starting a new venture in the Twin Cities area. We have a total of 6 programs in this series, and we invite you to join us for all 6 live or through our website afterwards at www.mbmentors.org. The 6 programs in this series are You Ready?, Make It Legal, Small Business Digital Marketing, Basics of a Business Plan, Financing Your Small Business, and Selling Basics. This is session number 2, Make It Legal. It was presented by one of our mentors, Lauren Herbst. Lauren has over 40 years of banking and business experience. You can contact Lauren through our website. This program covers the 5 most common legal structures small businesses think about forming when starting out. Lauren will cover the pros and cons of each. We hope you enjoy.
My disclosure here is that I am not an attorney, as I introduced myself, and therefore we suggest that if you want to get legal advice, and we'll talk more about this along the line, or any advice regarding insurance, etc., that you contact the professionals in that industry. There are some other resources that we'll talk about later. Next slide. Choosing the right legal business. We're going to talk about 5 common legal structures. Next slide. And those 5 are the sole proprietorship, a partnership, a limited liability corporation or LLC, an S corporation, and a C corporation. First of all, we'll start out with the sole proprietorship. Sole proprietorship is business is owned and controlled by one individual. And next slide. The sole proprietorship, some of the positives of a sole proprietorship is it's real easy to get it off the ground. And as long as you're using your own personal name, you do not even have to file with the Secretary of State. However, if you are using an assumed name, you need to file with the Secretary of State. But it's the simplest type of business legally, and also for tax purposes. There's a very simple form that you have to fill out, Schedule C, that's part of your 1040 form. There's no filing required to set it up, as I indicated. And some of the negatives of a sole proprietorship is that you have personal liability for the business operations. That is, if you are sued, it is you, there's no corporate shell. So you'll be defending that situation as an individual. And you could, some of your personal assets could be exposed. There is a self-employment tax also on all of your income. And so you have to keep that in mind. There are some types of entities where you can avoid some of that, but in the case of a sole proprietorship, you will have a self-employment tax, and you'll pay it on all of your earnings or your profits. It is more difficult also to sell or obtain financing for a sole proprietorship. Generally, corporations or LLCs are a little bit easier for banks to consider financing than a sole proprietorship. There's no backup. You're it. You're the person. Something happens to you, there's no backup. Also, the sole proprietorship has a limited life. When the individual or the owner dies, the business ends. So there's that's what I mean by limited life. Next slide. And by the way, any questions on that? If there's any questions, feel free. If not, I'll move on to the partnership. Partnerships lets 2 or more people or entities share the risks and rewards of the business venture. Next slide. Some of the positives of a partnership is that there's no filing required again, as long as you're using the names of those partners, the actual names. But if you use assumed names, again, you have to file with the Secretary of State. And by the way, the Secretary of State's office is very user-friendly. You can contact them, and they are one of the more friendly business or government organizations that we have dealt with. A partnership does not pay taxes on its income. It's a flow-through organization, and therefore the income taxes are paid by the partners individually. Now the negatives. On a partnership, you must file a separate return. It's a Form 1065, and that's attached to your personal tax return. Also, a partnership, you have personal liability for business operations, similar to the sole ownership. The partners could be sued individually, or they could be sued as a group, but there is personal liability there in a partnership. And all partners can bind the partnership. What I mean by that is that a single partner can bind, if they make an agreement with someone outside of the partnership, they can bind the partnership regardless of whether the other partners were involved or not. And so there are some risks that could be involved with that. Also, there's limited life for a partnership. If one partner dies, the partnership generally disbands or has to reorganize. And finally, let me just talk a little bit more about the partnership. If you're going to form a partnership, or you have a partnership and you do not have a partnership agreement, it is highly important, we highly recommend that you put together, with the help of your law firm, a partnership agreement to have the understanding upfront of what's going to happen to the partnership should someone have illness or die or whatever happens, that is covered in the agreement. So we highly recommend that. The next is a limited liability company. Forming an LLC is the simplest way of structuring your business to protect your personal assets in the case of your business is sued. So some of the positives of this type of organization are liability protection for the owners, officers, and directors, so that there's a corporate shell here that protects you. Centralized management, there's the ability here, whereas you don't have it in a sole proprietorship, obviously, is to have different people have different roles, and you can confine them as to how much they can commit the entity to. The company does not pay any income taxes. This again is a flow-through organization paid for by the individuals, owners of the company. And you have continuity of life with this type of entity as opposed to the partnership and the sole proprietorship. There is continuity of life. And then no separate tax return. Some of the negatives is, again, the self-employment tax is paid on all earnings. This is unlike the SCorp, and I'll comment on that when we get to the SCorp. And then adding a member to if you're a single member LLC and you add a member, that changes the structure to a two-member LLC, et cetera. And you need to make sure that you take care of that legally, because there are some changes that take place when you make that move. There's some jurisdictions that do not recognize single member LLCs, but I don't think there's very many anymore. I think that's pretty much been resolved. And just quickly on a limited liability company, I had an instance right in my neighborhood here where a young man about 4 years ago, when he was a freshman in high school, decided to start a lawn mowing company. And the name of the company is Mighty Matt Lawn Care LLC. And the interesting thing about this is that, as you can understand, as he has probably 60 or more lawns that he cuts in a typical week. And so he felt that he needed to have other people help him. Well, guess what? He formed an LLC to protect him that way, but he also carries workman's comp on the people that are helping him mow those lawns. So he's protecting himself, and he was very wise in doing that. And he's done a real good job. He's mowed my lawn now for several years. So that's an interesting piece about a limited liability company. Next slide, please. Now we'll talk a little bit about the two types of corporations, which is a distinct legal entity. Some of the positives, we're going to talk about the SCorp. Positives of a C Corp, strong, you have strong liability protection again for the owners, officers, and directors. You have central management. Again, you can confine the authority of different people within the company. And so that protects the corporation in some sense. And there's no limit to the number of shareholders in a C Corp. You can have as many as you want, and they can be different types of shareholders. And then there's perpetual existence again, which is a positive. This does not end with one of the people in the corporation dying. Some of the negatives. The big negative here is double taxation. You have not only the first of all, you got the corporation. If they make a large sum of money, they have to pay taxes on what they made. And then in turn, as they pay dividends to the shareholders in turn pay taxes on their dividends. So you have, that's why they call it double taxation. There is a whole separate tax return that you have to do for a corporation, and many corporations use outside accountants to help prepare their tax return. So there's a lot more work involved in doing a separate tax return for C Corps. And then of course you have higher administrative costs. You have to have annual meetings, you have to have stockholder meetings and directors meetings, et cetera. So there's a lot more administrative costs that are involved with a C Corp.
I'm gonna hang on right there. I've got people waiting to get in that I have to admit.
Okay.
And then we'll redo it. We'll keep it going.
Okay.
Sorry about that, guys. Welcome aboard for those who have been waiting. I apologize.
Okay, should we continue?
Yep, just hang on one sec.
Okay.
All right.
I think we pretty much covered the C Corp negatives, so we can go on to the next slide. We'll cover the S Corporation. S Corporations are subject to the taxing provisions in much the same manner as a partnership. They're subject to the provisions of subchapter S of the Internal Revenue Code, and you must file articles of incorporation with the Secretary of State. Some of the positives, of course, of an S Corp, or you have liability protection again for the officers, owners and officers and directors. You have centralized management. The corporation doesn't pay the tax. The tax flows through in this type of organization. You also have the continuity of life in an S Corp that you don't have in a partnership and a sole proprietorship. And most S corporations use the cash method of accounting, which is a more conservative type of accounting method. The negatives of a S Corp are separate tax returns. You have a separate tax return, and I show the number there. You have higher administrative costs with an S Corp than you do with some of the other entities, and limits to the number of owners. So the negative here is that you're confined to about 100 shareholders, but in most cases, smaller companies, and many of the companies I dealt with weren't worried about this particular issue. They weren't worried about having 100 shareholders or more. And only one class of stock here, whereas in the C Corp, you can have multiple classes of stock. Just one other quick comment regarding all of what I'm talking about, and that is, and we'll have this at the end of the session, but there is a great resource guide in the state of Minnesota put out by the development. It's the organization that's called Economic Development and Education Association, or DEED, that puts out a book on how to start a business in Minnesota. It's over 300 pages long. However, it's a great resource to look at when you have a specific topic that you want to ask about. It has a great index, a lot of resource information in it. And I would highly recommend that you get that. You can get it in the form of a CD, or but you can get the book itself, and many of the libraries carry that book as well. we'll have a picture of it and show it to you at the end. The next two slides are pretty much self-explanatory. We did not put the SCorp in here because we think that many of our listeners are in the other four categories. So I think this is pretty much self-explanatory, the sole proprietorship, partnership, and the owner liability, the transferability, and the ability to raise capital. So these are the various, just a chart that kind of goes through those issues to kind of put it in order. These are policies that I think most businesses need to at least take a look at and talk to your insurance agent about. They, starting with the next slide, would be business liability insurance, which protects your business from third-party claims. I'll comment a little bit more on that later. There's business owner's policy that combines business liability and commercial property insurance. And then the third type is commercial property insurance, which of course, if you have personal property or buildings you want to protect, that's what that covers. Next slide. And then there's commercial vehicle insurance, which I think is pretty self-explanatory. Professional liability insurance, sometimes referred to as errors and omissions, and I'll comment a little bit more on that. And workers' compensation insurance, which you have when you have employees, this covers them for illness and injuries on the job. And then in terms of the 6 policies, there are 2 different types of business liability insurance, as mentioned previously, general and professional liability insurance. The general liability insurance protects you and your business against common law tort claims. Things like personal injury or your premises, copyright and trademark infringements, libel and slander cases, etc. Who needs it? Well, it's more important for larger businesses and for businesses with brick and mortar presence. So if you have brick and mortar, pretty important. Professional liability insurance is mandated for certain high-risk professions in some states. Think attorneys, accountants, architects. This insurance is a way of protecting yourself against a lawsuit if you ever you're sued over a professional mistake. Let's put it that way. And then product liability insurance, if you're selling physical products online, you might be wondering if you need product liability insurance to cover yourself against defective projects. Unless you created the product yourself or had prior knowledge that product was defective, you probably won't be held liable. But you may be sued by a customer as a seller, but you will be able to countersue the manufacturer. And one final slide, and that's on other business insurance. We did not cover those. Just briefly, that's business interruption insurance and directors and officers insurance. We covered product liability briefly. It's especially important here in the case of insurance, again, to talk to your attorney or talk to your insurance agent about this. And if you don't have an agent and you need to contact one, the best way I find in finding the right person or entity is to talk to your friends who are in business and see who they're using.
Thank you for joining us. We are Minneapolis Business Mentors, and we offer free mentoring, guidance, and coaching to those thinking about starting a new venture or those already in business. We also provide workshops on topics of interest to anyone involved with small and medium-sized businesses in the Twin Cities area. In addition, we form and facilitate peer advisory group roundtables with CEOs, presidents, and those who run small businesses and are looking for a place to discuss their individual business needs, problems, and opportunities with peers in non-competing businesses and industries. You can contact us to learn more at www.mbmentors.org.